There's a certain kind of silence in Hollywood that's louder than any scandal. It creeps into the shadows between interviews, lingers behind carefully worded memoirs, and haunts the faces in old behind-the-scenes photos. It's the silence of someone who, for decades, has chosen elegance over exposure. Until now. Steve Martin, comedian, writer, actor, banjo virtuoso, national treasure. A man who turned absurdity into art and shyness into a brand. For over 50 years, he's made us laugh with his unshakable deadpan and unexpected warmth. But behind the white suit and boyish grin, insiders have whispered for years. Steve Martin doesn't always get along with everyone. Rumors have flickered through the backlots and dressing rooms. Alleged feuds, quiet, cold shoulders, averted eyes at premieres. The public saw chemistry on screen. But what did Steve really think when the cameras weren't rolling? Tonight, we step behind that carefully curated curtain, not to smear, but to understand. Who were the co-stars Steve Martin couldn't stand? Were there fights, creative clashes, unspoken resentments? Or is this just another case of fame feeding fiction? Because if there's one thing we know about Steve Martin, it's that he never reveals more than he wants to. So when he does, we listen closely. Let's go back, way back, to where the tension first began. The public persona versus hidden friction. From the moment he stepped into the national spotlight in the 1970s, Steve Martin wasn't like the other funny men of his time. While his contemporaries relied on punchlines and traditional setups, Steve brought a surrealist flair to stand-up. Balloon animals, banjos, a white three-piece suit that practically dared you not to take him seriously. He was silly, yes, but deliberate, and that contrast became his signature. Audiences adored him. He wasn't just funny, he was smart, distant sometimes, but always captivating. And when he transitioned to film, the acclaim only grew. The Jerk in 1979 cemented him as a comedic movie star. Roxanne, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Parenthood, Father of the Bride. Steve Martin could carry a movie, but more than that, he could elevate it. And that's where the friction starts to simmer. In Hollywood, when you're not just a star but a creative force, writing your own material, shaping characters, influencing the direction, ego naturally becomes part of the equation. But Steve didn't come across as egotistical in interviews. If anything, he was reserved. Still, many who worked with him over the years have noted that behind that calm exterior was a man with strong opinions, especially about comedy. On set, Steve Martin was known for being intensely focused. He wasn't one to crack jokes between takes. He wasn't a party guy. He came to work, and he expected others to do the same. For some, that was inspiring. For others, especially those who came from a looser, more improvisational school of comedy, it could feel cold. This clash of styles of expectations may not have erupted into screaming matches or tabloid headlines, but it left traces, a strange energy on set, a scene that took longer than expected, a quote in an interview that, while polite, held a little too much distance. And that's why the rumors never went away. Was it all smoke with no fire? Or was Steve Martin simply too polite to say what he really thought? To understand that, we have to look at the moments where the friction did bubble to the surface, however briefly. And we begin with one of Steve Martin's most beloved comedies, and one of his most complicated collaborations: the alleged conflicts and rumors. It was supposed to be a dream project, three comedy titans coming together in a film that would celebrate their unique brand of foolishness. Three Amigos, released in 1986, was directed by John Landis and starred Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it wasn't. From the outside, Three Amigos was a light-hearted romp through the deserts of Mexico with singing bush jokes, absurd action sequences, and costumes that seemed just a shade too tight. But behind the scenes, the set was reportedly strained, especially between Steve Martin and Chevy Chase. Now, there's no confirmed explosive falling out. No one threw a chair or stormed off the set, but whispers from the crew and later interviews suggest there were creative differences, mostly rooted in personality clashes and comedic philosophies. Steve Martin was a perfectionist. Chevy Chase wasn't. Known for his improvisational style and sarcastic demeanor, Chase had already gained a reputation in Hollywood for being difficult to work with, even before Three Amigos. According to insiders, Chase often challenged direction, resisted line changes, and approached scenes with a looseness that frustrated Martin's precision. Martin, who co-wrote the film with Lorne Michaels and Randy Newman, reportedly had a clear vision. He liked control. He liked structure. Chase, on the other hand, preferred chaos. The friction was subtle but real, and though Martin has never spoken publicly about any personal resentment toward Chase, the difference in their on-set energy was palpable. Martin Short, the youngest of the trio and the least established at the time, later joked in interviews that he felt like a mediator between the two. He remained close with both men, but his role during filming seemed to straddle a strange line, keeping the peace while trying not to pick sides. One former crew member, in an anonymous interview years later, noted, "You could tell Steve thought the material mattered more than Chevy did. There was a quiet tension, not shouting, but silence, which is sometimes worse." Later in life, when asked about the film, Steve Martin spoke warmly of the experience, but he never elaborated on his working relationship with Chevy. The praise was often directed at the film itself or at Martin Short. And perhaps that's telling. While it may not rise to the level of hatred, what Three Amigos hinted at was this: Steve Martin didn't hate co-stars recklessly. He disliked disorder. He disliked ego that overshadowed the work. And if a co-star embodied those things, even subtly, it left a mark. But Three Amigos wasn't the only time Steve's silent discontent reportedly surfaced. There were smaller moments too, often overlooked but revealing if you knew where to look. For example, during Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, 1987, Martin worked with the late John Candy, a man known for his warmth, improvisation, and emotional depth. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable. Yet even here, there was nuance. Martin was once asked what it was like working with Candy. He paused, just long enough to suggest complexity, and then offered a carefully chosen reply. He was a sweet guy who had a sadness in him. You could feel it. It wasn't criticism, but it wasn't effusive praise either. There was something distant, something unresolved. Perhaps Steve Martin struggled with performers who brought unpredictability, who colored outside the lines he so carefully drew. But if there was one dynamic that remains murky, complicated, and rumored in more than one direction, it was his relationship with another frequent collaborator, Goldie Hawn. Coming up next, we'll step into the world of House Sitter and explore the whispers of tension between two comedic giants who made chaos look effortless on screen. Goldie Hawn and the Battle of the Spotlight. In 1992, Steve Martin and Goldie Hawn co-starred in House Sitter, a romantic comedy about lies, love, and architecture. On screen, they were opposites with undeniable charm. Martin, the uptight straight man; Hawn, the whimsical tornado of mischief. The chemistry clicked, audiences laughed, critics were split. But behind the scenes, that's where the cracks started to show. Unlike the quiet, creative tension of Three Amigos, the House Sitter set was allegedly marked by subtle power struggles. Not fights, not tantrums, but small, cutting glances and moments of quiet frustration. It was a film about two actors, both used to leading the charge, suddenly forced to share a stage with someone just as smart, just as funny, and just as unwilling to back down. Goldie Hawn had her own legacy. She wasn't just a blonde with a giggle. She was sharp, business savvy, and had years of success as a producer and star. Steve Martin, ever the perfectionist, approached his work with surgical precision. He liked his lines crisp, his rhythm tight. Goldie, by contrast, brought spontaneity and chaos. She thrived in the unpredictable. And Steve didn't. One source close to the production once described the atmosphere as controlled tension, noting, "There were days when it felt like they were acting in separate movies, even while in the same scene. Both brilliant, both trying to steer the ship. To the public, everything looked fine. In press interviews, they complimented each other politely, but the subtext was often visible if you listened closely." In one 1992 press junket, Steve Martin was asked what it was like working with Goldie. His reply was simple: "She's a force of nature." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that ends before it reaches the eyes. Goldie, in her typical way, was more playful, yet possibly more pointed. Steve's so precise. It's like dancing with someone who's counting steps while you're trying to fly. Was it just clashing methods, or something deeper? There were rumors, never confirmed, that Steve Martin had attempted to rewrite several scenes mid-shoot to favor his character more, dialing back Hawn's comedic dominance. Others claim Hawn improvised extensively, sometimes blowing through takes and leaving Martin visibly irritated. But perhaps the most telling moment came years later. When asked by Entertainment Weekly to list his favorite co-stars, Steve Martin named Diane Keaton, Lily Tomlin, and Queen Latifah. Goldie Hawn? Absent? Intentional? Who knows? But in Hollywood, omissions can be louder than endorsements. Still, Steve Martin never called her out. He never aired dirty laundry, and that's a pattern that defines his career. When he disliked someone, or disagreed with them, he didn't fight. He retreated. He withdrew behind a veneer of calm, let the work speak for itself, and moved on. But for all the quiet exits and polite deflections, there is one rare moment, buried in a memoir, that gives us perhaps the clearest insight into how Steve Martin handles relationships that go sour. To find that moment, we have to go back to his own words, to the pages of Born Standing Up, what Steve Martin has actually said. Steve Martin's 2007 memoir, Born Standing Up, is not a gossip-laden exposé. It's reflective, understated, and, in many ways, mournful. He writes not just about comedy, but about the loneliness of performance, the weight of perfection, the early fame that drained him dry. But nestled among the insights and anecdotes is something rare for Steve Martin: emotional candor. He opens up about relationships not through direct accusations, but through silence, distance, and emotional omission. And in a book that spans decades of collaboration with other comedy legends, something becomes strikingly clear. Steve Martin doesn't talk much about other stars. There are exceptions. He writes warmly of Martin Short. Their chemistry, both on and off screen, has always been rooted in deep mutual respect. Their current collaboration on Only Murders in the Building is arguably one of the most joyful creative partnerships of his late career. But others? Their names vanish. Or, when they appear, it's brief, devoid of emotion, color, or warmth. It's almost surgical. In one passage, Steve recounts a difficult tour moment, not involving a named co-performer. But the language is telling. There was a tension in the room I couldn't identify. Everyone smiled, but no one was laughing. It's a line that reads like poetry. But it also reads like confession. Steve Martin doesn't name the person, but he remembers the feeling. He describes his early days in television, writing for the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, and later appearing on Saturday Night Live. Though surrounded by now iconic names, he rarely indulges in personal reflections about them. No long praises, no gripes, just work, scenes, progression, and that's how Steve Martin works. He avoids confrontation by omitting it entirely. You won't find him blasting anyone in interviews. You won't see him post-retirement dishing dirt on a late-night couch. But you will find moments of subtle withdrawal, the kind of professional distance that says more than gossip ever could. There's a famous story about the filming of Parenthood, 1989, directed by Ron Howard. The set was crowded, the cast was huge. Diane Wiest, Rick Moranis, Mary Steenburgen, Keanu Reeves. With so many personalities, tensions naturally arose. But according to one production assistant, Steve Martin isolated himself between takes. Headphones on, book open, he didn't engage much unless it was time to shoot. When asked why, the assistant recalled, he didn't dislike anyone, but he didn't love them either. He just didn't need them. That distance, that quiet self-containment, it's the clearest thread in understanding how Steve Martin navigates difficult relationships. He doesn't fight, he fades. He doesn't hate, he edits. Which brings us to perhaps the biggest mystery of all. Why has Steve Martin never once publicly criticized a co-star by name? The answer lies partly in his upbringing and partly in his deepest fear. Not failure, but humiliation. Not being disliked, but being misunderstood. And if you understand that, you understand why Steve Martin's hate, if it exists, is always hidden between the lines. But there is one moment, just one, where a public comment came close to lifting the veil. It involved a scene partner, a disagreement, and a line that was quietly cut from a major film. Coming up next, the one documented incident where Steve Martin's dislike may have altered the script itself. A conflict buried so well, most people never noticed. Until now, the scene that disappeared. By the mid-1990s, Steve Martin was no longer just a comedian turned actor. He was a veteran of the industry, a box office draw, a respected writer, and someone whose creative voice held real power behind the camera. And with that power came quiet influence. Influence that, according to some insiders, once led to a scene being removed from a major film. Not because of pacing, not because of story flow, but because of friction between Steve Martin and a co-star. The film was Father of the Bride Part 2, 1995, a sequel to the wildly successful 1991 remake of the original Spencer Tracy film. Martin reprised his role as George Banks, the neurotic but lovable patriarch. Also returning were Diane Keaton as his wife and Kimberly Williams as his daughter, but this time, new energy came in the form of Eugene Levy, playing a wacky, eager-to-please OBGYN with an over-the-top presence. Levy, known for his improv-heavy style honed on SCTV, was encouraged by director Charles Shire to bring that improvisation to the set. What he didn't know, allegedly, was that Martin wasn't particularly fond of improvisation, especially when it shifted focus away from his character's emotional arc. According to one report from a crew member shared anonymously in an industry forum years later, there was a particular scene in which Levy's character outshone George Banks, transforming what was meant to be a straight man reacts moment into a laugh-heavy bit centered on Levy. It got huge laughs during test screenings. But then, it was gone. The scene was quietly trimmed in the final cut, and while no one said it outright, the implication was clear. Steve Martin had requested the edit. Was it ego? Or was it artistic integrity? Steve Martin has long maintained a belief that story should always come first, and his comedic choices are often tied to character development. But those close to the production whispered that it wasn't the scene Steve objected to. It was the disruption, the loss of emotional control, the shift in dynamic. Levy would go on to work with Martin again in Bringing Down the House, 2003, a commercial hit but a critical flop. And their chemistry? Off. Levy seemed stifled. Martin, by then older and more subdued, delivered a performance that felt restrained. In one promotional interview for Bringing Down the House, a reporter asked the two what it was like working together. Eugene Levy responded with practiced warmth. Steve Martin responded with a single sentence. Eugene has a unique energy. It was polite, distant, and oddly hollow. To fans, none of this was obvious. They saw the charm, the chemistry, the laughs, but to those who knew how to read the undercurrent, something had shifted. Steve Martin had, for once, exerted his power not through confrontation, but through quiet correction. He cut the scene, he cut the energy, he cut the connection. And that's how Steve Martin exposes his co-stars, without a single word, through edits, through omissions, through what's left unsaid. Still, there's no evidence he ever truly hated Eugene Levy, or Chevy Chase, or Goldie Hawn. But in the language of Steve Martin, hate doesn't come as a headline. It comes as a cold shoulder, a rewrite, a character realignment. He reshapes the story so the tension dissolves, at least for the audience. But for those on set, the memory lingers. So what does this tell us about Steve Martin? Not the persona, but the person. To understand that, we have to step away from the rumors, the co-stars, and even the films, and into the silence of Steve Martin's own reflection. The one moment where he came closest to admitting how deeply other people can truly wound him. The silent wounds of a perfectionist. In one of the most striking passages of Born Standing Up, Steve Martin writes about the early days of performing in small clubs, places where the laughter was sparse and the lights harsh. He describes standing alone on stage, hearing only the clink of glasses and the occasional polite chuckle. But it's not embarrassment, he recalls, it's exposure, a raw, vulnerable sensation that shaped everything he became. Performing, he wrote, is about surrendering your dignity in the hopes that someone else will laugh. It's a beautiful line, but hidden within it is something darker. The trauma of putting yourself out there, only to be met with rejection. That's what Steve Martin remembers, not the applause, but the risk. And that risk didn't just come from audiences. It came from collaborators, from actors who could take a scene and twist its rhythm, from performers who didn't respect the architecture of a joke the way he did. Steve Martin never had the outlandish public meltdowns of a Marlon Brando. He didn't feud loudly like Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. His conflicts were colder, quieter, more surgical. And this is perhaps the most revealing truth of all. Steve Martin didn't hate people. He hated disruption. He hated unpredictability. He hated when someone brought chaos into a world he had carefully constructed. It's why the rumors feel real, even when there's no hard evidence. It's why fans still talk about Chevy Chase, Goldie Hawn, Eugene Levy, as if there's unfinished business, unspoken words. Because with Steve Martin, silence is never just silence, it's judgment. And yet, he has never weaponized that silence to destroy anyone. He hasn't sat on late-night couches dragging names through the mud. He doesn't write scathing chapters in memoirs. He doesn't tweet cryptic jabs. Instead, he lets the work stand. He trims the scenes. He walks away from collaborations that no longer feel aligned. He closes the curtain gently, but firmly. And perhaps the saddest truth of all is this. For someone who has made millions laugh, Steve Martin has always seemed just a little alone. Not lonely, but alone. A man walled off by brilliance, guarded by wit, defined by control. Because for Steve Martin, control is everything. It is the defense against chaos, against mediocrity, against the ache of being misunderstood. And when a co-star threatens that control, even accidentally, it leaves a scar, not a dramatic one, but a precise, invisible incision, the kind only Steve Martin knows is there. So, did Steve Martin ever hate his co-stars? Not in the way Hollywood loves to gossip, not with screaming matches or scandal, but in his own way, quietly, subtly, enduringly. Maybe yes. And maybe that's what makes it more haunting, Because when a man who says so little finally chooses to say nothing at all, that's when you know the story was real, a legacy of precision and shadows. In a town that thrives on chaos, Steve Martin carved a legacy through control. While other comedians leaned into spontaneity and provocation, Martin built his empire on restraint, on jokes designed like Swiss watches, on performances that never begged for attention but always commanded it. And in that quiet mastery, something got lost, or maybe it was never offered at all. Emotion, warmth, affection. Not for the audience, he gave us plenty, but for the people who stood beside him, the co-stars, the scene partners, the fellow architects of the illusion. When Steve Martin did love someone, like Martin Short, you could feel it in every interview, every glance, every performance. Their friendship was not just visible, it was palpable. But when that love wasn't there, there was a chill. Not cruelty, not even disdain, just absence. Absence of camaraderie, absence of emotional generosity. A professional, courteous vacuum where something more human should have been. And maybe that's the truth Steve Martin never wanted to admit aloud, that he worked best when he was alone, when he didn't have to share the rhythm, when the punchline was his to sculpt without interference. Some might call that arrogance, others might call it brilliance. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. But here's what remains undeniable. Steve Martin has never exposed his co-stars, not in the way headlines crave. He didn't name names. He didn't drag reputations through the mud. Instead, he did something quieter, something more lasting. He edited, he omitted, he left them out of the story. And in doing so, he said more than any interview ever could. Because in the world of Steve Martin, what you leave behind is as revealing as what you choose to show. And now, as he steps gently into retirement, with a legacy untouched and a voice still sharp, we're left not just with laughter, but with questions. Who did he truly respect? Who did he quietly resent? And what scenes were never filmed, never released, because something behind the camera didn't feel right? We'll never fully know. But maybe that's the magic and the melancholy of Steve Martin. He made us laugh without ever fully letting us in. And maybe that's what he wanted all along. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below, as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.